Good evening. Let me cut myself down in my ear so I don't have to hear me talk. Give me a second. There we go. How y'all doing this evening? How y'all doing this evening? How y'all doing this evening? Welcome to another segment of Afristream, where we are giving you news of the diaspora from a Pan-African perspective. News from the diaspora from the Pan-African perspective. So we thank you for coming. Now, this is again, we always try to, at the World of Akibaland and the African Speaks After Stream, we always try to make must see live stream. We always try to make sure we put out must see live streams, something that gives you something to think about and leads you to building a better black world. Yes, so if you're watching us on Facebook, please make sure like, you comment, and share. Like, comment, share. Make sure that this particular broadcasting gets out to those who are interested and enjoying. So if you see it, you like, comment, share. We appreciate you. If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so that you can get a an awareness or a bell or be notified of all of our existing programs. Sunday night or Sunday afternoon, we have Akibaland Inspirationals. Tuesday night, we have the African Speaks. Tonight, Thursday night, we have Afristream, and on Saturdays, we have African History at 1 and African Spirituality at 2. Why? Because why do we put so much work in what we do? Because we are focused on the rise of the African. Our social media Pan-African movement, something that we are truly, truly fixed on making happen, bringing black people together. This is a legacy movement, and we are not stopping until somebody else sits in this seat and I'm rocking with the ancestors helping the next generation. Right? I'm not even worried about anything else, but we do welcome you to this segment. Now, what we were having to do, or what we had planned to do in our segment, was this was supposed to be the follow-up stream on Rwanda. So this was supposed to be Rwanda Part 2. Rwanda Part 2 tonight. However, I had somebody hit me up, and and he's been hitting on me up on a regular basis, talking about international news, brother, international news. I said, obviously you haven't watched Afristream, because we give international news, and we also lend it to a Pan-African perspective of it. It's not just the way it's reported, but we give it to. I try to analyze the data and bring it to you in a way that the view that is given is broader. It comes from a position where we're educated and clear on how to move forward with this, or what we should expect from ourselves in this experience. And so tonight, what he sent me the news clip that we'll watch, but we're going to have to build this news clip up so that I can break this down to you in a better light than what the news clip gives, right? Now, tonight, he wanted us to discuss the issue of what's happening in West Africa. The military coups in West Africa. So there has been approximately 8 coups, 8 military coups in the last year and a half. 8 in West Africa. Well, what is not news is military coups in Africa. That's like normal for us. What is not news is the American influence on a particular military coup. What is not news is America training foreign soldiers to produce military coups in their countries, or do things on behalf of American or European benefit. That's not news. Now, the way I want to bring this, which is a whole different perspective, to give you the foundation of news that's in this, because most of you have not probably heard that there were, military coups going on, and this has been the most military coups in the past 20 years. 8 in a year and a half. It's a lot to say. That's news, because that's a lot to say. America being behind it, that's not news. We know this. We know this. Now, how I want to take this is I want to take an indirect approach to showing the news clip, and then we'll break the news clip down. The news clip is pretty long, so we're going to flow. Now, I don't know if you guys remembered what was happening in Zimbabwe back in the day, about, we say a good, maybe 10, 20 plus years ago. I'm not quite sure you're sure if you remember. Now, in Zimbabwe was going through a land reform program. That's what they call a land reform, where they were kicking out white folks out of the country. They're going to kick the white farmers out of the country and give the farms back to the people it was stolen from during colonization. They said, we don't need no colonizers in our country. Y'all pack your bags. You be glad that we letting you keep your money in the bank account. Pack your bags, collect your money, and bounce. And so my hardcore revolutionaries was like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I was not applauding that effort. Not the fact that I don't want to see Africa as independent as it should be, but I said, there's a process to this. There's a process to liberation. There's a process to freedom. And so the argument was, well, how are they supposed to do it? Brother, are you really down for the struggle? Man, this person was in, when it got in my grill and the conversation got heated. I said, well, wait and see. Why? Because we have to also take a look at what influence did the European countries have in Zimbabwe. I said, that's Britain, Great Britain, and Great Britain has a relationship with United States. So you know that these are mega powers. So they need to be able to secure what they're doing, right? So if they have any influence or any aid coming in from a European country, they got to make sure that they don't need this aid, because the colonizers are going to strike back one way or the other. One way or the other. So we got to be strategic as we pull away. Strategic as we create and build. Strategic. And with the reform, I said I couldn't read. There was nothing I read that said that this was a strategic process. And lo and behold, Zimbabwe fell. Whatever relationships they had in the European sector dried up. I don't think that they connected well with neighboring African nations for support. Because you're a nation making a move, you want to know that you can, as black men, you want to know that you can make this move. And it's okay for them to make the attempt, because in that conversation they stated that, well, we're going to live and die by our own sword. Every man deserves that. But when you have a people in your community, you don't want that. You want to make sure that it's strategic when pulling out. So how can we make this happen? So of course they told some of the farmers that you can come and get some of your land back, or if not, you're not going to get your land back. We'll give you some land, but we need farming because we got to eat. And so they were not ready to actually produce what was needed to maintain Zimbabwe, and so they needed the assistance of the people who were doing it. Now I wish they would have reached out to some other farmers that was willing to go before the transition was made. So again, I'm saying you got to be careful, because they couldn't, I mean, when you're looking out for foreign aid, for some reason they don't look, we don't look within each other, because we are all still struggling to try to build up to pull away. We build up to pull away. You collect your resources and you make your planning to pull away till you cut to the umbilical cord. You build up. It takes 9 months for a baby to grow inside a mother's belly before they bust out like, yo, I want to be independent. And so this, I think I will always say there's a process to liberation. There's planning to liberation. And you have to be careful of what European nation has their hand in the cookie jar. Because when it comes to the motherland, they all got their hand in the cookie jar. And that's what, and we can use, well, I have it queued. We can use Haiti also as an example of what I'm talking about. where we know that, the American government wrote the Haitian Constitution. Really? Yes. The American government is almost always behind the regimes, the regime change. Yes. Even the recent one. America is going to always make sure, if we're not planning correctly, they're going to always make sure that a particular government that they have their hands in are doing what is needed for them to control. Ooh, let's see this. Let's get this up. Whatever resources that country has, whatever resources, the natural resources, the land resources, whatever resources, we know these things. And we know that they use people that look like us against us. We know these things. The issue is, it's the process. Now, not only is, so we always have to remember when we're watching this, because we always think it's us. We always think it's us, right? Oh, black people can't get together. We always go to war, so and so. It's not us. We know this. We live in hopefully you know this. We live in a woke generation, where when you are being puppeteered. Woo. That's it. You know when you're being governed behind closed doors. You know that we are not in control of all those resources. Nowhere close. We know that Africa has been carved up so long ago by so many different countries. Physically carved up. Physically carved up. That's a shame. Then we also know, and I don't have a slide for this one, that we are economically carved up. The motherland is economically carved up, and it's like China, is loaning out governments in major debt. China said, we will be a world power by loaning money. We'll give you whatever you need. And Africa is the next booming continent. Every nation has an opportunity to walk into a first world order. Not a new world order the way they talk. It's the first world. We got first world, second world, third world civilizations and poverty. There's certain countries in Africa who are on the borderline of breaking first world status. And Rwanda is one of them, and that's what was the conversation, showing how the planning of independence is crucial to liberation. That's news. That's news. Us watching coups in Africa from across the pond, not news. This is what we grew up watching. Us knowing that America is behind those regimes, because where else they getting the guns from? That's the news. That's the news that when we are watching things like this happen. Okay, it's time to take a look at what interest does America have in the countries that are rivaling. And then now you think about it, because if you watched Afristream at any given point in time and you saw what the other countries are doing in regards to developing a sense of independence. Independence. We talked about Rwanda. We talked about Ghana. Right? We said that Africa as a whole, we talk about the agricultural development in Africa that's needed. We're the next millionaires. We talk about even investment in Africa. The next set of millionaires coming out of the motherland are going to be in the agricultural realm, because they said that Africa as a continent has to raise their production of food by 70% in the next 10 years. Right? So now if you see this happening and you know something's about to develop, Pan-African perspective, open up your mind sight. Meaning that there's going to be certain things that's going to happen in the continent where these European countries are not going to let go. These third world areas. These areas that are so impoverished that, okay, nope. We know that when we bring technology to this government, it'll go into the trillions. And if we still control it from the beginning, from the ground up, America's going to get a piece of that pie. If the governments don't learn how to separate themselves from their puppeteers. Think about it. Now, one of the things that we want to discuss tonight before we get started, and I'm about to get started in a few minutes because this is a pretty long. And please do not mind the white journalist. I told the brother when he asked me to do it and he showed me the clip, I said most of the time I'm not showing white journalism on Afristream. That's not what I'm doing. We too black for that. But because he asked me, I'm doing it. So brother, if you're watching and then you hear it and you're looking, right? I'm going to do what you asked me to do. Okay. Now, one thing that I want to let you know: war make money. Wars make money. In third world countries, sometimes that's the only economy that they have. War makes money. So when you sit down and you have a government, and you'll see this in the and we'll pull it apart in the dissection of the video, right? Because I guess he wanted I don't point fingers. We already know about the demise of the motherland and who's behind it. That's not a shocker. That's not news anymore. But war make money. It makes money in third world countries when there is no jobs, and the only job for you is to be a militia, because they get war money from countries. How you get the guns, how they get the jeeps, how they get the tanks, how they get everything. That's money that they that's use a loan. And so when you get in charge, you get some of that money. Now we can't give you aid. There's something called military aid. Yes, military aid. And certain governments, certain third world countries will only get military aid. Ain't that something? And then if the regime takes over a area, and after that regime takes over the area and it starts building up, but the people are still hungry. The people want to eat. They want medical care, and they want better food. They want irrigation. They want to modernize. Well, third world countries are not allowed to get any type of aid like that in terms of building up the government. So what do? Contact the U.S. The U.S. puts another army together, overthrow that government, gives them more money for the other regime coming up. War makes money. Now in this slide, you'll hear a conversation by an author where she talks about, where they makes a statement, a book that's supposed to be coming out. War makes worlds. War makes worlds. Now what we want to do is again, look at the countries, look at the ones that they're going through. We would and I would have to have a deeper dive in what are the resources, uranium and a couple other resources that they have. Then you got the land resource, farming resource. There's a lot of things that they could do, but they would have to figure out the plan before they begin to separate from those puppeteers. It's a process, y'all. Liberation and colonialization and then corporate political colonialization. That's what this is. This. When you see this happening, it is political colonialization. It is how a foreign government keeps hold of a third world country in the motherland. Political colonization. That's a new word. Y'all write that down. Look it up. We're going to talk about the digital colonization of the whole continent soon, and that'll come up. But let's take a look at the news.
In Mali toppled President Ibrahim Boubacar Keita, sparking a wave of military coups across Africa. Last April, a military council in Chad seized power following the death of Chad's longtime president, Idriss Deby. Then on May 24, 2021, Mali witnessed its second coup in a year. On September 5th, the armed forces of Guinea captured the nation's president and dissolved Guinea's government and constitution. Then on October 25th, Sudan's military seized power and put Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok under house arrest, ending a push in Sudan towards civilian rule. And finally, 2 weeks ago,
before we finished out, she said, long-standing president unseated. Why? Because he couldn't feed the people. He could get money as long as he stayed a military state, but the minute you try to get support to help develop civilian need, you can't get any help anymore. That's a shame. Let's continue.
January 23rd, Burkina Faso's army leaders, led by a U.S.-trained commander, deposed the nation's president, suspended the constitution, and dissolved parliament. That's 6 coups in 5 African countries in just under a year and a half. Over the weekend, the African Union condemned the recent wave of military coups.
Now, what I always want to be focused on was, what are the resources in these countries, right? Who has their hands in those resources? You'll understand now why coups are always there. Not because black people can't get together. Has nothing to do with black people getting together, but everything that the puppeteer has controlled. And that's the same for Haiti. It's no different than anything that we've always seen. So we have to get to a point where we, Pan-African perspective, find ways to financially support our countries that we trying to raise up. We have to. If we don't become a one people and realize that the issue is a global issue where we want to be citizens of the world and not victims of puppeteers. Let's continue. We got to work together.
This is Ghana's president, Nana Akufo-Addo.
The resurgence of coups d'etats in our region is in direct violation of our democratic tenets and represents a threat to peace, security, and stability in West Africa.
The African...
Now, I could not find his complete statement, because you know how they do. They will sit down and take it and only give you a piece of what he said. But he's right. We have to suspend them right now because it is a threat to what we've put together and what we as an African United Nation are putting together. So if this is where you are, we're going to push you aside and let you do your work, because those areas in that united effort of African countries to come together to work as a one, yeah, we said, they actually, and he's the, African of the year because of his vision. They said civilian life comes first, not military life, not military aid. Civilian life comes first. Even Rwanda, when they said, well, is he a strong man? Yeah, because you can't vote him out no time soon. But look at what came first, not military aid, but the development of civilian life where individuals can move up and enjoy the world's modernization. It takes skill, but I always say be careful, because even Ghana still has European hands in their pot. Ain't that something? I came up with that when he said can't. Well, we'll talk about that on another Afristream. Let's continue.
Union has suspended 4 of the countries, Mali, Guinea, Sudan, and most recently Burkina Faso. Many of the coups have been led by military officers who have received U.S. training, those U.S. officers. The Intercept recently reported U.S.-trained officers have attempted at least 9 coups and succeeded in at least 8 across 5 West African countries since 2008, including Burkina Faso 3 times, Guinea, Mali 3 times, Mauritania, and the Gambia. To talk more about this wave of coups across Africa, we're joined by 2 guests. Samar Abalushi is an anthropologist at University of California, Irvine, focusing on policing militarism and the so-called war on terror in East Africa. Her forthcoming book is titled War Making as World Making. Brittany Maché is an assistant professor of environmental studies at Williams College, where she focuses on conflict and environmental change in the West African Sahel. Brittany, let's begin with you, Professor Maché. If you can talk about this region of Africa and why you believe they are undergoing this number of coups or attempted coups.
Thank you, Amy. It's great to be here. So one of the first comments that I want to offer is that often when these kinds of things happen, it's easy to sort of put a frame of inevitability on all of these coups. So it's easy to just say that West Africa or the African continent writ large is just a place where coups happen, as opposed to asking really complicated questions about both the internal dynamics, but also the external dynamics that help contribute to these coups.
Now that is a Pan-African perspective. Not to just say this happens, but we are aware of the external issues of what makes these things occur in these third world areas. Let's continue. Here it comes. And I appreciated her analogies because she's the one who's coming up with was it war making as world making. And I'm gonna get the book. I'm gonna read the book. Yeah, it sounds like it's gonna be a good one. Let's go.
So as far as internal dynamics, that can be things like populations losing faith in their governments to respond to basic needs, a kind of general disaffection, and a sense that governments aren't actually able to be responsive to communities, but also
Not being able to be responsive to communities. Man, why? Because they can only get aid for war. Watch what goes on.
external forces. So we've talked a little bit about the ways that commanders in some of these coups, especially thinking about Mali and Burkina Faso, were trained by the US and in some cases also France. So these kind of external investments in the security sector effectively harden certain sectors of the state to the detriment of democratic governance.
Now, we said, let me see if I choose the right one. We have to be aware of who is doing what. Okay, the colonizers. We got to be careful of who has still got their hands in the cookie jar. And so it's not news. But the issue is, why are your hands in the cookie jar? How can I get my hands out so I can change? Because governments can't address civil issues because they don't get enough aid for civil issues. So there's certain infrastructure and leadership that has to come. And that's why I applaud the way the brother in Rwanda is doing it. But let's keep watching.
And Professor Michel, you mentioned France as well. Several of these countries were part of the old French colonial empire in Africa, and France has played a large role in recent decades in terms of their military in Africa. Could you talk about this impact as the United States begins to exert more and more influence in Africa, and as France pulls back in terms of the stability or instability of a lot of these governments?
Yeah, I think it's really impossible to understand the contemporary African Sahel without understanding the disproportionate impact that France has had, both as the former colonial power, but also as a disproportionate economic powerhouse in the countries, basically exerting economic influence, resource extraction across the West African Sahel, but also in setting an agenda, especially over the last decade, which is really focused on strengthening militaries, strengthening police, strengthening counterterrorism operations across the region, and the ways that, again, this effectively hardens the security forces. But I also think, especially thinking about the U.S. Influence, that the U.S. in attempting to sort of carve out a kind of new theater for the war on terror in the West African Sahel has also contributed to some of these negative impacts that we've seen across the region. And so the interplay of both the former colonial power and then also what has been described by activists on the ground as a kind of new imperial presence by the United States, I think both of these things are effectively destabilizing the region under the kind of auspices of advancing security. But what we've seen is just increasing instability, increasing insecurity.
She said a mouthful. She said a mouthful, but you have to look at you got France coming in and coming out or slowly moving out. You got the US taking hold. She said we got to look at the extraction of resources. Now again, and then the stability of rebel forces, not rebel forces, but of armed forces. And so maybe America is making that a base for them to create an army scenario where they're paying. This is how brothers get jobs, which sucks. It sucks. So it's not black on black just for black on black. We know this. Well, you know what? I have a friend who's a Trump. He's a Trump supporter, and he's always talking about Africa against Africa. And I'm like, yo, dude, do you understand that the colonial mindset is always stuck inside and the brain of the African, the motherland. And not only that, they keep their hands in the cookie jar, and they will make sure that individuals are in place, the puppeteering. But we want to see some other things when it comes to the economic instabilities and how these countries just can't get any help, and what it takes a larger Pan-African experience to make a move on the motherland. Let's continue.
And in terms of this instability in the region, what about the issue, obviously, that has drawn the United States' attention increasingly in the area of the rise of Islamic insurgencies, whether from Al Qaeda or ISIS in the region?
Yeah, so even as kind of global terrorism networks are active in the West African Sahel, so Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, but also offshoots of ISIL, I think it's important to think of the violence that's happening across the Sahel as really localized conflicts. So even as they tap into some of these more global networks, they are localized conflicts. Where local communities are really feeling that both the kind of state governments are not able to respond to their needs, but also increasing both competition over a sense of governance and accountability mechanisms, but also a kind of general disaffection and the ways that people perhaps see armed revolt, armed opposition as one of the few avenues left to stage claims, make claims on governments that they see to be really absent and non-responsive.
Absent and non-responsive to the civil needs of people. My government, and then because a lot of times when you see these coups, the people in the government, you see them, they march and they happy. Why? Because some militia came up and said, "I can do better. We can feed you. We can give you better life. So we're gonna overthrow the government." And you see them walking around, they playing, you know what I mean? They got instruments going on. They overthrowing something. And that, which is another thing that we, to take a look at. Because after a while, yeah, if you overthrow a government and the government regime is good, so now we're saying, okay, so now can you change the civil foundation? And then if you heard what they said about United States trying to get a stronghold in those areas to counteract terrorism, Al Qaeda. Well, why don't you, instead of trying to take over the government, elicit their help and not try to, well, we're gonna do it the way we want to do it. We want to control the country so that we have more of a stronghold of what happens in that area with the insurgent, because it's a Islamic insurgents. It's not as an, and I'm gonna denounce that statement. Islamic insurgents. There's nothing wrong with the rise of Islam. It's something wrong with the rise of terrorists. You got a lot of Christian terrorists called the USA that goes into other countries and kills folk. That's terrorism. But they don't sit down. You don't hear the word Christian insurgents. You feel me? You got to be careful of the double standard. No, it's not Islamic insurgents. It's the issue of terroristic insurgents. It don't matter what faith they are. They're terrorists. So you can have terrorists. You have terrorists out of every spirituality and discipline. So it's not an issue of and they got used to that. But so that you say Islam, you get scared. No, that ain't happening. I say Islam, I think of Allah. I don't think of terrorists. Sorry. Same way when you say Christianity, you know what I mean? Some of us, we think of ancient spirituality, the baby of ancient spirituality. I don't think of white terrorism. I know what they used it for. But I see, when I study it, I see a faith that came out of African wisdom, African spirituality, that was taking control by Europeanism to keep us conditioned. And so now they're conditioning us by saying Islamic insurgents, like Islam will only produce terrorists. No, that's not true. Not true at all. Let's continue.
Professor Mache, in a moment, we want to ask you about the particular countries, but I wanted to turn to Professor Samar al-Baluchi, anthropologist, University of California, Irvine, who focuses on policing militarism and the so-called war on terror in East Africa, contributing editor for the publication Africa is a Country, and a fellow at the Quincy Institute. If you can give us the overall picture of this area when it comes to militarism, and particularly the U.S. involvement in terms of training the officers involved in these coups. I mean, it really is astounding. In the last 18 months, we have seen this number of coups. In no time in the last 20 years have we seen this number of coups across Africa in this amount of time.
Thank you, Amy. It's good to be with you on the show this morning. I think you're absolutely right. We do need to ask about the broader geopolitical context that has emboldened these military officers to take such brash actions. Between the US-led war on terror and the wider international community's fixation with quote-unquote security, this is a context that centers, if not privileges, military solutions to political problems. I think there's a tendency in the mainstream news outlets reporting about the recent coups to place external players outside the frame of analysis. But when you factor in the growing role of the US Military Command for Africa, which is otherwise known as AFRICOM, it becomes clear that it would be a mistake to interpret the events in these countries as the product of internal political tensions alone.
Military solutions for political problems. Military, what they said. And so now AFRICOM is, I guess it's a place that trains them. I'd have to dig some more deep in that. But they use military solutions for political problems. Also, when dealing with the issue of terrorism, yeah, America's going to be aggressive about what they can control and where, so that they can get a hold. I'm not promoting it. I'm just letting you know that we woke. We not sleep. So we already know that this is happening. They control the militias that go into these countries and mess up third world countries. My question is always, what can we as a people do about it? Let's continue.
For listeners who are not familiar, AFRICOM was established in 2007. It now has approximately 29 known military facilities in 15 states across the continent. And many of the countries, as you mentioned, that have experienced coups or coup attempts are key allies of the U.S. in the war on terror.
Did you get it? Did you get it? Now you're understanding the concept. What we're saying, it makes money. It makes money.
And many of the leaders of these coups have received training from the U.S. military. Now, the combination of training and financial assistance, coupled with the fact that many of these quote-unquote partner states allow the U.S. military to operate on their soil, has meant that these African states have been able to vastly expand their own security infrastructures. For example, military spending on armored police vehicles, attack helicopters, drones, and missiles has skyrocketed. And whereas the militarism of the Cold War era prioritized order and stability, today's militarism is defined by a constant readiness for war. Up until 20 years ago, few African states had external enemies, but the war on terror has fundamentally reoriented regional calculations about security, and years of training by AFRICOM has produced a new generation of security actors that are both ideologically oriented and materially equipped for war. And we can think about the ways in which this turns inward, right? Even if they're trained for potential combat outside, we might interpret these coups as, as a turning inward of this kind of framework and orientation towards war.
And it's not a turning inward. It's not them fighting each other. It's never that. It's never that. But what they're trying to paint the picture is America has to do this to fight the war on terrorism. No, it doesn't. What we need is African countries to be able, who are third world countries, to be able to have full control of their resources, right? instead of training them how to go to war, train them to how to build infrastructure. If you really want to you want to stop the war on terrorism, share the wealth, right? Instead of trying to squash everything, trying to take all the resources, share the wealth. You might not have an enemy if you share the wealth. You're trying to dominate the globe. Slow down. Let everybody else function from the experience of their own work. Share the wealth. Let these countries and these governments have full control over imports and exports of their own country. Let them create their own societies, because this is what the African Union has done with these other countries who are a part of it, right? Let's continue.
Because the US and its allies rely so heavily on many of these states for security operations on the continent, many of these leaders are often able to consolidate their own power in a way that's largely immune from external scrutiny, let alone critique. And I'd even go a step further to suggest that partner states like Kenya joining the war on terror has actually played an instrumental role in boosting its diplomatic profile. It seems counterintuitive, but Kenya has been able to position itself as a quote unquote leader in the war on terror in East Africa. And in some ways, championing the project of counterterrorism is not simply about access to foreign aid, but equally about how African states can ensure their relevance as global players on the world stage today.
Again, how African countries can have a place on the world stage today. It's not even just in global relevance. Look, and again, Kenya's not having coups. They're not having coups. But they said, you know what? Look, we're going to control what we have, but we're also going to help the globe minimize terroristic cells. So we'll support that. But by no means are we going to give up leadership to our country. No, we're not going to do that. Again, there's a process to this. And I believe as time goes on, the smaller third world countries will look at the second world countries as they move toward first world countries and take note on how to make the proper steps forward. Going back to the Zimbabwe scenario, you got to be careful when you cut the ropes from your puppeteers. Why? Because they're going to strategically try to recapture you. That's everything. When a brother's running, you running, yeah, you got to be smart. You just can't be running and all of a sudden you're going to walk into, I'm a slave running from the plantation and I get hungry. I'm going to walk into a place and get me a sandwich. I'm going to go, I'm going to steal a chicken at night where they can't see me. There's a process to liberation. There's a process to freedom. There's a process to break away from colonization. It's a transformation. Wow, we're about to hit it. There's a transformation that has to go on in our minds where we sit down and say, let us analyze ourselves in the sight of the Creator. And let's ask the Creator for the creative intelligence according to the situation that we sit in. How do we correctively steer out from this hold, from this puppeteer, where we don't have to keep falling back into an economy of war? They haven't figured that out in some of those countries yet. Let's continue.
The last point that I want to make is that I think it's incredibly crucial that we don't reduce these developments purely to the effects of imperial designs, because the national and regional dynamics absolutely matter and warrant our attention, particularly in the case of Sudan, where the Gulf states may currently have more influence than the United States. So we just need to recognize the risks that come, of course, with broad sweeping analysis like what I'm offering you here when we're talking about often vastly different political contexts.
So what she's saying is that every time that happens, we have to look at that for that situation. Every situation is not the same. Circumstances are always different per coup. It's not always for the same reasons, the same situations. But let's just take a look at it. Let's analyze it and let's see what's real and what isn't real. All right. Again, this is the woke generation, they say. So me telling you that America has their hand in the coups is not nothing new. That's not news. Learning the details of why, but then also what's news is being able to look at Rwanda and figure out how they were able to pull away 20 years ago from genocide, which was also U.S. driven. Ain't that something? British driven. It was Britain. It was UK. When they pulled out and they said, well, we're going to give this to you or we're going to do that, they put the two against each other. Ain't that something? Look at that up. Look that part up. We might have to do that. Go back and take a re-look at that. And how Britain played a hand in the self-hate of Rwanda. Colonialism. It has the mark of slavery, the way we have the mark of slavery. Let's continue.
And Professor Belushi, in terms of the, you mentioned the vast amount of military aid that has gone from the United States to these countries. Some of these are some of the poorest countries on the planet. So could you talk about the impact that that has in terms of nation building and in terms of the outsized role that the military plays in these countries, even as a source of employment or income to the sectors of those populations that are part of or allied with the militaries?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think it's important to keep in mind here that the kind of aid that has been channeled into the continent is not limited to militaries and to the military domain. And what we see when we start to look more closely is that a securitized approach and a militarized approach to all social and political problems has effectively taken over much of the entire donor industry in Africa in general. Now, this means that it becomes very difficult for a civil society organization, for example, to obtain a grant for anything other than something related to security. And there's been some documentation in recent years that shows the effects of this kind of colonization of the aid sector on population.
Colonization of the aid sector. Colonization is everywhere, even in the finances they send to help you. We can only give you money if you go to war. This is not black on black, and it's never been black on black. It's only black on black because this is the best. And if you realize with one of the coups, they didn't kill him. They just took him and put him on house arrest and said, okay, we're going to take over the government. Why? We don't really want to kill you. We just need more aid. You feel me? Okay, let's get more aid and see if you can find a way to in the process of once we get that aid, once we get this money for these jobs, once we can pay our soldiers, because almost every black man, when you look at it, that's all they have. Black men getting jobs with the army. So how can you continue to get that money? By security aid. It's an economic foundation that the government said, we're going to keep you down. We know this. The issue is those countries and those leaders who figured out how to get around it need to share the blueprint, or we need to come up with a blueprint and share it ourselves. We need to get to a point where African American community leaders are communicating with African leaders in other governments and states and communities and discussing these things and this partnership. Pan-Africanism is not just a philosophy. It can be a living experience where we see each other as a global family. Ain't that something? Let's continue.
Across the continent, in the sense that they're not able to get funding for much needed issues, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, and that type of thing. Now, I do want to mention here that in the case of Somalia, we can see there are the African Union has deployed a peacekeeping force to Somalia in the wake of the Ethiopian intervention, the US-backed Ethiopian intervention in Somalia in 2006. And we can start to see, if we track the funding that has been used to support the peacekeeping operation in Somalia, we see the degree to which a growing number of African states are increasingly reliant on military funding, in addition to the funding that comes directly to their military governments for training purposes. They're increasingly reliant, their troops are increasingly reliant on funds from entities like the European Union, for example, to pay their salaries. And what's really striking here is that the peacekeeping troops in Somalia receive salaries that are often up to 10 times what they earn in their home countries when they're just deployed in kind of standard form back home. And so we can begin to see how many of these countries, and in Somalia it's Burundi, Djibouti, Uganda, Kenya, and Ethiopia, that have become increasingly reliant on a political economy that is structured by war, right?
Being having a foundation on a political economy that is structured by war. That means you can't even see peace because it has not been a plan put together for black folk to figure out how to get aid just to eat. The realization that you live on the richest planet on earth. You might just have to grab a farm and start farming for yourself. Colonialization in the mind and the spirit is real. So when we talk about it here, because you got black folk, we still trying to get black people to work together in the States. And we got more freedom than they do. We have more access to everything than they do, and we still struggling. I can't, I get yelled at when I said, look, I'm a part of a generation that ain't done nothing. And the older we get, all we want to do is travel and party. But we got this going on like the world is fixed for black people. No, it has not been fixed for us. But we have to make a decision to fix it globally.
Right? We see an emergent form of migrant military labor that has had the effect of protecting and offsetting public scrutiny and liability for governments like the United States, right, which would otherwise be deploying its own troops to the front lines.
Professor Brittany Miche, I was wondering, you are a specialist in the Sahel, and we're going to show a map of the Sahel region of Africa. If you can talk about just its significance, and then focus particularly on Burkina Faso. I mean, the facts there, you, in 2013, met with U.S. Special Forces who were training soldiers in Burkina Faso. It is just the latest in a coup where the coup leader was trained by the U.S., pouring more than $1 billion in so-called security assistance. Can you
I'm sitting up in here talking and I didn't even know that I was on mute. I'm sorry. We're going to continue because I said a whole mouthful.
talk about the situation there and what you found in talking to these forces?
Sure. So I want to sort of offer a kind of general framing comment about the Sahel, which is oftentimes written off as one of the poorest regions in the world, but actually has played both an integral role in kind of global history, sort of thinking about the mid 20th century and the emergence of international humanitarian assistance, but also continues to play a really key role as a key supplier of uranium, but also becoming a kind of target of ongoing military operations. But to speak a little bit more about Burkina Faso, I think it's really interesting to sort of return to the moment of 2014, where then leader Blaise Compaoré was ousted in a popular revolution as he attempted to extend his rule by rewriting the constitution. And that moment was really a kind of moment of possibility, a moment of a kind of revolutionary sort of idea about what Burkina Faso could be after the end of Compaoré's 27-year rule. And so in 2015, I met with a group of U.S. Special Forces who were conducting these kinds of counterterrorism and security trainings in the country. And I asked very pointedly if they thought that given this moment of democratic transition, if these kinds of investments in the security sector would actually undermine this process of democratization. And I was offered all kinds of assurances that part of what the US military was in the Sahel to do was professionalize the security forces. And I think in looking back on that interview and seeing what has subsequently happened, both the attempted coups that happened less than a year after I conducted that interview and now the successful coup that has happened, I think this is less a question about professionalizing and more a question of what happens when war making becomes world making, to take up Samar's book title, but when you sort of harden a specific sector of the state, undermining other aspects of that state, rerouting money away from things like the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Health, to the Ministry of Defense.
You get that? They can't even use the money for agriculture, education, health. They got to send it back to the military. Ain't that something? Again, we as a people have to come up with a better form or means to break the strings of the puppeteer. That's what news is. Pan-African perspective. We already know what the Caucasians or the European influence is to control areas for their benefit. We already know this. But when you're a third world country, and somebody offers you $1 billion for a military, to create a economic foundation in your country based off of war, what are you gonna do? To eat, go to war. It's a shame. That's a shame. There has to be a generation that is developed again, that takes a look at who we are as a people, and move Pan-Africanism from a statement that flows off the tip of our tongues to an experience that's world round. They have to be able to educate each other. All these third world countries need to learn how to farm because you have the land to do it. They need irrigation. They need infrastructure. They all of it. But the only finances that you can get is for warfare. Well, what we hope in and we stated during the next 10 years, the millionaires coming out of Africa will be in the agricultural area because they have to raise up to the 70%. We are going to hope and we're going to pray that as the other areas, surrounding areas, develop economically, develop global influence, develop being able to protect what they create from European invasion or influence, that they teach it to their brothers. The colonized mindset is a slave mindset, and it's not easy shaken the same way the black man's mindset here in America is a slave mindset, and it's not easy to be shaken. A state of transformation has to happen. We have to be in that scenario where we are learning the steps to release ourselves from bondage. Woo! Because we already know Who's running it? I think she got like a minute and 30 seconds
It's
left.
no wonder that a kind of strongman in a uniform becomes the kind of most likely outcome of that kind of hardening.
And I know I stopped it. A strong man in a uniform, a militant man willing to go up against a government that is not feeding the people. That's why you get people cheering in the streets, because they believe that this particular militant who's taking over a government who is not feeding us will take over the government and feed us, not realizing that the government has a deal with the devil where you can only have a political regime that feeds war. They need new friends.
I also do want to mention some of the reports that we've seen of people celebrating these coups that have happened. So we saw it in Burkina Faso and Mali. We also saw it in Guinea. And I don't want this. I would sort of offer this not as a kind of anti-democratic sentiment that sort of infuses these communities, but again, this kind of idea that if civilian governments have not been able to respond to grievances of communities, then a leader, a kind of strong leader who says, I will protect you, becomes a kind of attractive solution. But I would sort of end by saying there is a robust tradition, both across the Sahel, but in Burkina Faso in particular, of revolutionary action, of revolutionary thinking, of agitating for better political lives, for better social and community lives. And so I think
revolutionary thinking for better community lives, revolutionary action for better community lives, revolutionary movements for better community lives. I call that world of equivalent. Revolutionize, but we're going to teach the kids and our youth and our young adults who they are and whose they are, and allow them to use their imagination to build a world that works. That's what we need. Young individuals and even old individuals who have the mindset that understands the puppeteers are here and they have their reasons. We have to get to the point where we learn the process of snipping the strings of that which you control. First, we may fall, just like Zimbabwe did, but we'll find ways to stand up. I believe we can do it. I believe West Africa is just a process of finally getting tired of what's happening in the world, to the point where, you know what? Yeah, these political regimes, we're done with them. As you see Rwanda grow, you see Ghana grow, you see Nigeria grow, you know, you're going to want pieces of that reality. And so when somebody comes and say, I can overthrow the government for you and give you a piece of that reality, we know that the US and France, they name France, and even China buying up the land. They don't care about that. They just want the resources. Well, sooner or later, there will be a nation that is raised up that will obey. Africa's watching, as the way Tuna Chechi always say. There's a place that we watch, where I get the news from. But Africa's watching, so is the Black America. Let us have a Pan-African perspective as we look at this news. There are things that we know, but there are so many things that we need to do. You know, and let's find ways to raise a generation that will produce and do. With that being said, one love. I should have been ready to go out, but I wasn't ready yet. But I'm ready now.